All right, we're going to wrap up this unit looking at speciation, which is really the fundamental question that Charles Darwin was trying to find out when he went on his voyage on the Beagle. And, where do new species come from? And there are a lot of different ways that species can come about. But here we're looking at two main ideas. And one is associated with the idea of gradualism, because it's a very gradual process over time where one species will simply change and evolve into another species, so that if the original species still existed, that second species, species B in this case, would not be able to reproduce with species A. Even if they could get back together again, they wouldn't be able to reproduce fertile offspring. And likewise with species C. So these are separate species because they cannot interbreed. They cannot breed with one another and produce offspring. And that's really what we call the biological definition of a species. So this is not only gradualism, the idea of gradualism, but it's also referred to as phyletic speciation, which you'll note is very linear, versus divergent speciation, where species A will diverge, and typically this happens by forming two different populations that are isolated from one another in one of many different ways, and we'll be looking at the different ways that two populations can get isolated. But the idea is that once the populations get separated from each other, they evolve in different directions and evolve into different species. So again, even if species B were to come back and try to breed with species A, they wouldn't be able to, and same with species C. So they're all separate species. So it all has to do with isolation and eventually becoming reproductively isolated so that they cannot interbreed with one another, and therefore they're considered separate species. So one way that two populations can become reproductively isolated is through behavioral isolation. So what we're looking at here are two examples, the blue-footed booby and the salamanders. They both perform rituals, mating rituals, in which the male performs for the female. And so in the case of the blue-footed booby, they do kind of like a dance, and if the male doesn't do the dance just right, then the female won't choose him as a mate. Same with the salamander. The salamander does a kind of positioning, a posing, and if he doesn't do it just right, the female won't breed with him. But in this scenario, there can be a situation where if a certain number of males are doing a dance a little bit different, and some of the females go ahead and mate with them, then that can actually split the population in two, and they become reproductively isolated, and they continue to evolve in opposite directions and eventually become so different that they can't breed with one another again, and in that case, two new species have arisen, or at least one more new species. That's an example of what we call sympatric speciation. Sympatric means one country. So in other words, one population, even though they are in the same area at the same time, they split into two populations due to behavioral isolation. Geographic isolation is an example of what we call allopatric speciation. Allopatric means other country, which is a situation where two populations, a species will be split into two populations and by a geographical barrier. So it might be a mountain range, it might be a river, it might be a lake. Something gets in between the two populations and prevents them from coming in contact with each other, prevents them from migrating, prevents gene flow between them. And over time, as they are separate populations, the allele frequencies change and they evolve in different directions, and eventually, even if they could get back together, they wouldn't be able to interbreed and produce fertile offspring, and therefore they're considered separate species. Then a final form of isolation is known as temporal isolation, and temporal refers to time. So this is a situation where there might be a mutation in flowers, for example. So flowers, maybe they bloom at a certain time, and therefore they're available to reproduce because the flowers are the reproductive organs of the plant. So maybe they open at different times due to a mutation, and therefore they don't mate with, it splits the population in two. So they're mating at two different times, and eventually that keeps them separate. They're breeding separately, and that if they remain separate for long enough, and allele frequencies change and they evolve in different directions, and eventually they can interbreed with each other again, then they are new species. So again, temporal isolation is controlled by circadian rhythms or the biological clock, and the biological clock is subject to changes in genes, mutations in genes, just like everything else. And so that can cause two species to reproduce at different times, splitting the population in two. So if you'll recall, Darwin hypothesized that the finches on the Galapagos Island all descended from a common ancestor that found its way to the island from the mainland. And so here we're seeing, I put a couple tables together so we could see them all together on one table, a number of different species, and notice that they're split between tree species and ground species. And it gives all kinds of information about what they eat and everything, but their beak shape really is determined by their food source and what they eat. And for sure, beak shape is a polygenic trait, so there are a lot of different genes that are controlling, the length and the width and the strength and how narrow the beak is and how pointed it is, and all kinds of different characteristics that go into the shape of the beak. All subject to natural selection. So these different finches, they became isolated, and they occupied different niches. They evolved to occupy different niches where they had greater fitness, higher fitness, and were selected for in those niches. And it all started with the amount of variation in the shape of the beaks in these different finches, and just variation in general in finches, and the variation in habitats or the different niches in the Galapagos Islands. So since Darwin's time, a lot of people have gone back to test Darwin's original hypothesis about the finches, and Peter and Rosemary Grant are husband and wife scientists who decided to do just that. So the Grants traveled to the Galapagos Islands, and they tested the medium ground finch on Daphnia major, one of the islands. And they observed that during drought, food becomes scarce, as you might imagine, and individual birds with different sized beaks had different chances of surviving during the drought. So when food was scarce, what they discovered was that birds with larger beaks were more likely to survive and reproduce and pass on their genes for larger beaks, or their alleles for larger beaks. So larger beaks were selected for in the population. So this is the change in beak sizes that they measured during a drought, and it was produced by natural selection, evolution by natural selection, and in a relatively short period of time. So this is some of the first evidence that was produced supporting Darwin's hypothesis that the finches on the Galapagos all the different species were produced by natural selection and evolution. So as the scenario goes, one finch species found its way to the Galapagos Islands from mainland South America, and so that founded a new population in the Galapagos. Since there are many islands, there were multiple populations on different islands, and different islands have different habitats. Some of the Galapagos are like deserts, and other islands are more like rainforests. So these isolated populations, they were geographically isolated. In other words, they pretty much stayed on their own island, and then they changed. Changes in their population gene pool, changes in the allele frequencies over time, adapting to those different habitats on the different islands, to different niches. Eventually, they became reproductively isolated, so that even if they were to go back together again, they weren't able to reproduce with one another, and therefore they were considered separate species. And when they did come back together, there was ecological competition between them, which caused them to diverge even further and become even more different. So the idea is that this scenario happened over and over. Not the finch species coming from the mainland. That only supposedly happened once, just one ancestral species from the mainland. But then over and over and over on the islands, this scenario happened over and over and produced all the different finch species that are now on the islands, all descended from one common ancestor. So this graphic shows a little bit more how it works. So this is population A that came over from the mainland, and then some from that population flew to a different island and established another population, but they're still the same species, just on different islands. But they tend to not fly from island to island so much, so they remain geographically isolated on their separate islands. And over time, species or population, the second population, adapted to that island and became a different species, so that even if species B were to go back and try to mate with species A, they wouldn't be able to. They wouldn't be able to produce fertile offspring, and therefore they're separate species. Or if species B came back to on the same island with the first species, they would compete with one another, ecological competition, and that would cause them to become even more different. Or even produce a new species, species C. So that's the scenario, over and over and over. Geographic isolation, eventual reproductive isolation, and ecological competition, producing more and more species. So what the grants discovered and what continues to be discovered, all the evidence points towards the idea that species descended with modification from common ancestors that live in the ancient past, and species evolve over time. And as we find more and more fossils, we just find more and more evidence of evolution by natural selection. And the other four forces too, like genetic drift.